A strange call from Brazil in the middle of the night leaves billionaire Jackson Ellis stunned. "I'm your son." What begins as doubt soon awakens buried memories and unfolds into an unexpected journey of fatherhood, redemption, and a boy named Hope. Will Jackson risk his entire empire to become a father? Jackson Ellis sat alone in his office on the 52nd floor, the city lights reflecting off the glass behind him like an emotionless painting. Everything around him was perfect to the point of sterility, from the spotless ebony desk to the expensive watch ticking steadily on his wrist. It was nearly midnight, but for Jackson, work was always his closest companion, and a safe haven from the things he couldn't control: people, emotions, and memories. Suddenly his phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. An unknown number flashed on the screen, an international code. He frowned. Almost certainly a spam call or some partner oblivious to time zones. Jackson was about to let it go to voicemail, but then a vague hunch made him pick up. "Hello?" His voice was low, firm, impatient. A long silence followed. He was on the verge of hanging up when, "Hi, Dad?" Jackson froze. One word, 3 letters, but they struck his ears like thunder in a clear sky. He gripped the phone tighter, his heartbeat faltering. "I think you've got the wrong number," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But the child's voice came again, more urgent this time. "Please, can you come get me? Mom said if I ever needed help I should call you." A chill ran down his spine. He stood up and walked toward the window, as if he needed to see something real. The lights, the traffic, to prove he was still awake. "Who are you?" "My name is Leo Santos. My mom was Helena Santos." That name, Helena, tore through the armored shell of Jackson's emotions like a jagged cut. He hadn't heard anyone utter that name in nearly a decade. No one dared, not even himself. He stared at his reflection in the glass. Cold, rational, detached. A man Helena had once seen through, then walked away from. "Helena?" He repeated it, as if summoning the ghost of a memory. "How do you know my name?" She had pictures. Of you. Of the 2 of you together. She kept them in a box under the bed. She told me stories when I was little. Said you were smart, that you wore fancy cologne and always smelled like power. Jackson's throat tightened. He remembered. That cologne had once made Helena tease him, calling it bottled arrogance. She'd sneak a spritz onto her wrist and say, "Now I'm untouchable too." They used to laugh. A lot. Then the laughter stopped. Then the talking stopped. Then they stopped existing in each other's lives. "Where are you?" Jackson asked, his voice hoarse. "In Porto Alegre, Brazil, at a shelter. They said I can't stay much longer." Silence stretched between them. Neither knew what to say next, until Leo spoke again, as if pouring out his last breath. "If you're not my dad, I'm sorry, but if you are, please. I don't have anyone else." A sharp beep sounded. The call ended. Jackson stood motionless in the expensive room, the cold phone still in his hand, but his heart, for the first time in years, burned hot, as if a crack had just formed in the fortress of emotions he'd built his whole life. And through that crack, the past began seeping into the present. Jackson Ellis had never let a phone call unsettle his mind, but that night he sat for hours in the dark, lights off, the city's glow outside the window brushing across his impassive face, as if trying to illuminate the emotions struggling within. A child named Leo, claiming to be his son, saying his mother was Helena. Just one name, yet it dragged a storm of memories in its wake. But memories were liars, sweet enough to make you want to believe, even when they were no longer real. Jackson stood, poured himself a glass of scotch, but his hand trembled slightly. He hated that feeling, the sensation of losing control. There had to be an answer. There had to be evidence. There had to be logic. He dialed. Angela? I'm here, Mr. Ellis. Send me Michael Porter's contact info, now. Angela didn't ask why. She knew Jackson only called his private investigator when something truly rattled him. And that was as rare as snow in the desert. Minutes later, Jackson was connected with Michael, a former FBI agent whom Jackson still hired to vet competitors before big deals. I need you to look into a name, Leo Santos, about 10 years old. Mother, Helena Santos, currently at a shelter in Porto Aura, Brazil. I want everything you can find. Michael paused for a beat. Suspect. Fraud. I don't know. Jackson's voice was dry. I just need to know if it's real. The call ended. Jackson tossed the phone onto the desk, then leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, as if asking himself, if it's real, then what? He remembered the last time he saw Helena, on a dreary, rainy afternoon in Brazil. She gave a faint smile as he said goodbye, her eyes dry but carrying something fractured within. You don't need to worry about anything, she'd said. I've never asked you for anything, and I never will. She'd kept her word. She vanished like a gust of wind. No letters, no calls, no clinging. And him? He didn't look back. After all, the past never turned a profit. But now, a child, bearing the name Santos, calling him Dad. Jackson set the glass down, his eyes glinting in the dark. He'd controlled everything in his life, power, money, reputation, but this child was the one thing that left him feeling utterly exposed. He stood, walked to the filing cabinet, and opened a small drawer at the bottom where he still kept an old faded photograph. Helena stood in the sunlight, hair tousled by the wind, his arm resting lightly on her shoulder. He picked up the photo and whispered quietly, If you hid this from me for 10 years, what were you afraid of? Outside, the night remained still, but in Jackson's mind, the storm had already begun to brew. Jackson Ellis didn't sleep for 3 straight nights, not because of work, nor because of worry, a feeling he'd long since trained himself to leave behind, but because of Helena. She returned like an undercurrent, unannounced, silent, but powerful enough to drown the entire system of beliefs he'd built. On the screen before him, Jackson reopened the investigation files Michael had sent, details that seemed disjointed at first, but each line cut like a blade. Helena Santos. Died of cancer, no health insurance, no next of kin, left behind a son, Leo Santos, 10 years old. A photo appeared. The boy stood in front of the shelter, his eyes gaunt, tired but strangely bright. Those eyes. Jackson had seen them in the mirror once. He reached out, lightly touching the screen, the outline of the face, the thin shoulders, the messy black hair, all too real, too close. That boy was Helena's flesh and blood, and if he was hers, could he not also be his? Jackson closed his eyes. Memories flooded back like an old grainy film. Some scenes faded, others starkly vivid. Brazil. 10 years ago, a monotonous trade conference, a meeting room filled with the hum of air conditioning and perfunctory handshakes. And then Helena walked in. She was an interpreter, with eyes deep as the night sea and a smile that slowed everything around her. Jackson, then a young executive swallowing ambition whole, had never met anyone like her. Helena didn't care about power or wealth. She teased him, challenged him, saw through him, and made him forget the things he'd thought untouchable. His guard, his mask, his loneliness. They were together like two flames, brilliant but destined to burn out. When the business trip ended, Helena had said, "We don't belong to the same world. You have mountains to conquer, and me, I just need flat ground to walk on." He nodded. Didn't ask. Didn't hold on. And then he left, without a backward glance. Now, with her gone from this world, the only thing left was a child standing between two realms that both his father and mother had chosen to abandon. Jackson sank into his chair. Over the years, he'd done everything right by the standards of success. Money, fame, power. But none of it could answer the question bleeding in his heart. If she never asked for help, never called, never wrote a single line. Then why did she tell her son to call me? Perhaps she knew that one day he'd have to face it. And that moment was now. Jackson stood, reached for his coat. He dialed Angela. "Book me the earliest flight to Brazil. Do you want me to arrange security as well?" "No." A beat of silence. Then he added, his voice almost a whisper, "I'm not going to negotiate. I'm going to apologize." The sleek black car rolled slowly through the winding streets of Porto Alegre, leaving behind crumbling buildings, peeling paint, and unfamiliar faces peering out. Jackson sat silently in the back seat, his hand gripping the window frame lightly, his eyes fixed on the blinding sunlight outside. A light too real, too close, refusing to let him retreat into the rational excuses he usually relied on. When the car stopped in front of the rusted iron gate of the shelter, his heart, strangely, slowed. A small sign hung crookedly on the wall, Casa Esperanza, House of Hope. House of Hope. Jackson gave a faint, bitter smile. Hope had never been something he believed in. The door opened. A woman stepped out to greet him, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion but her voice gentle. "Mr. Ellis, I'm Marta, the center's director. The boy is inside. He has been hoping you'd come." Her words twisted into Jackson's chest like a slow-turning knife. He followed her through a narrow hallway where children sat drawing with worn-down colored pencils. Their eyes flicked up, curious, wary, then dropped back down as if accustomed to adults merely passing through their lives. Finally, they stopped at a peeling wooden door. "Leo?" Marta knocked softly. "Someone's here to see you." The door creaked open. The room was small, cramped, and worn. On a fold-out bed sat a thin boy, knees drawn up to his chest, staring out the window. He turned his head, and Jackson's world went silent. Those eyes. There was no mistaking them. They were Helena's, yet they held something else, the guardedness of a child too familiar with being left behind. The two stood gazing at each other, as if time hadn't yet caught up to reality. Jackson spoke first. His voice was low, softer than usual. "Leo?" The boy gave a slight nod, saying nothing, but his eyes didn't leave Jackson. Jackson stepped inside and sat on an old plastic chair nearby. The air in the room felt thick, as if it held 1,000 unasked questions. He began, then stopped. For the first time, words, the tool he'd always wielded with mastery, betrayed him. Leo kept watching him, neither shrinking back nor opening up. Finally, the boy whispered, "I wasn't sure you'd come." Jackson swallowed hard. "I wasn't sure either, but then I did." A pause. Then Leo lowered his head and said so quietly, "Mom said, if I ever felt lost, I should call you. Just once. She didn't promise anything, just said, you might be disappointed, but you might also get to hear your dad's real voice for the first time." Jackson closed his eyes. Those words, they echoed like a final message from Helena, sent from the other side. He looked at Leo, the messy hair, the arms clutching the pillow like a tiny fortress, and in that moment, Jackson no longer saw a stranger. He saw himself, a version suffocated by loneliness, doubt, and a longing to be named. He spoke slowly, each word carved from his soul. "If your mom were still alive, she'd probably hate me for not knowing sooner, but she was right about one thing at least. I can't turn my back on you again." Leo didn't reply, but his eyes for the first time blinked softly. Something nameless fell, not from his eyes, but from somewhere far deeper. A heart learning to breathe again, after years of being sealed shut. The waiting room at the testing center was silent, save for the steady ticking of the clock's second hand, as if reminding Jackson that he was awaiting something beyond the grasp of logic. The DNA results, a piece of paper, a number, and perhaps a truth that would tear through every defense he had ever built. Leo sat beside him, quiet, He didn't ask anything. He just sat there, eyes fixed on his thin hands, his back slightly hunched as if bearing the weight of the world on his shoulders. Jackson glanced at him. There was something in that silence that made it hard for him to breathe. The boy didn't hope. He didn't fear. He just waited. As if he had been waiting his entire life. A staff member in a white lab coat stepped out, holding a sealed envelope. "Mr. Ellis?" Jackson stood, his heart pounding in stiff, mechanical beats. He took the envelope, his hand suddenly ice cold. A part of him wanted to throw it away, to return to his orderly world, where there were no emotions, no son, no Helena who was gone. But another part was stronger. He opened the envelope, read it, and froze. 99.9% probability, paternal relationship confirmed. All surrounding noise vanished. The entire world shrank into a single line of black ink. Clear, undeniable. Leo was his son. Blood, flesh, a piece of Helena, and of him. Jackson lowered the paper slowly, as if afraid it might explode in his hands. When he turned to look at Leo, the boy was still watching him, his eyes holding neither hope nor anger, just waiting. "It's real," Jackson said, his voice low and hoarse, as if someone had just choked the words out of him. "The results say you're my son." For the first time in his life, the word son slipped from his lips, not as a title, but as a confession. Leo blinked slightly, a small movement, but Jackson noticed the boy's entire body tremble faintly. "So, are you going to leave again?" The question was as light as a breath, but it struck Jackson at the deepest part of his soul. He felt as though someone had slapped him across the face with the pure innocence of a child who had learned not to expect anything from anyone. He knelt down, something he had never done for anyone in his life. His knees hit the cold floor, his eyes level with Leo's, no walls left between them. "I'm sorry." Leo stared at him. He didn't ask why. He didn't demand compensation. There was only silence, waiting to see if that apology was truly a beginning. Jackson reached out his hand, not touching, just holding it there, open, trembling. A few seconds. A breath. A slow gesture. Then Leo placed his small hand in his. And in that moment, two men, one wealthy beyond measure, the other so poor no one remembered his name, found something they had both thought was lost forever. A family. The luxury car glided smoothly through the electronic gate, entering the upscale complex as if stepping into an entirely different world. A place where glass walls reflected the sunset, and trees were trimmed so neatly that there was no room for randomness. Leo sat in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the window, his hands gripping the straps of an old backpack he'd carried for the past 3 years, the only remnant of his previous life. Beside him, Jackson glanced over. He wanted to say something. A reassurance, a simple question, but he stayed silent. He didn't know where to begin. He didn't know how to bring a child who had lost everything into a place that had never made room for messy things like memories or pain. The elevator doors opened, ushering them into the penthouse level. The penthouse doors slid aside gently. Leo hesitated as he stepped in, his eyes blinking rapidly at a space too vast, too bright, too cold. Marble floors stretched endlessly, everything like a still photograph. Leather chairs, bookshelves, a dining table so long no one would dare sit at it alone. On the walls hung expensive paintings, perfectly aligned, but none of them were portraits, no family photos, no traces of humanity. Leo walked slowly to the floor-to-ceiling window, where the city was beginning to light up. He placed a hand on the glass. Below, millions of tiny lights flickered like lost stars. "Too high," he whispered. Jackson stood behind him, nodding slightly. "It's a beautiful view, but not everyone gets used to it." Leo didn't reply. He slipped off his backpack, setting it beside a chair. But he didn't sit. He didn't move further, as if he feared the place might shatter if he touched it too hard. Jackson showed him to his room, a space smaller than the rest of the apartment, but still 3 times larger than the spot Leo used to share with his mother in the shelter. Fresh bedding, new books, a desk with a study lamp, an empty bookshelf. Jackson smiled awkwardly. You can put whatever you want here. Comics, models, anything that makes it feel familiar. Leo looked at the shelf. Empty. Like him right now. I don't have anything to put there. The words caught in Jackson's throat. He wanted to say, then we'll fill it together, but he stopped himself, realizing sometimes a promise to a child accustomed to abandon is the cruelest thing of all. That night, they ate dinner across from each other. The vast table stretched between them. The sound of cutlery clinking against plates echoed like lonely raindrops in a house too quiet. Leo ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid to spill something he couldn't reclaim. Has your mom ever made this dish? Jackson asked, trying to bridge the gap. Leo shook his head. She couldn't afford beef. Silence fell again, this time thicker, colder. When night came, Jackson stood outside Leo's room, watching the faint light spilling through the crack under the door. He didn't knock. He didn't go in. He just stood there. A father who didn't know where to start, staring at the door as if it were a mirror to his own heart, where, for the first time, there was an empty space reserved for something he'd never prepared for. A father's love. Saturday morning. Jackson had woken up early. He didn't usually do that, but today he wanted to create something different, a beginning, a new rhythm of life. He had personally made breakfast, or rather tried to. The kitchen was a mess, the eggs were slightly burnt, and the orange juice was a bit sour. But he felt lighter, at least, because he was trying. Leo sat across from him, his eyes fixed on a slice of bread sloppily spread with butter. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. I can just eat crackers. I'm used to it. Jackson froze. He smiled, but it was the awkward smile of someone unsure whether they'd just failed or been hurt. It's okay. Dad wants to try. The word dad still felt foreign on his tongue, and it felt even stranger when the one person he wanted to hear it from avoided meeting his gaze. They ate in silence. Throughout the day, Jackson tried to create moments, inviting Leo to play chess, suggesting a movie, proposing a walk in the park. But each offer was met with a polite shake of the head or a reluctant nod. When Jackson suggested taking Leo to buy some new clothes, the boy quietly said, I only need 2 sets. Switching between them is enough. Jackson tried to stay calm, but inside he felt as though someone had slammed shut a door he hadn't even fully opened. That evening, as Jackson walked into the living room, he saw Leo curled up on the couch, clutching his old backpack tightly, despite the clean, fully furnished bedroom just a few steps away. Leo. The boy looked up. Those eyes, still Helena's eyes, but they seemed to have learned how to cut away hope. I'll just sleep here. I'll clean up early, Jackson frowned. Why don't you sleep in your room? I'm not sure if it's really mine. Jackson's chest felt like it had been punched. He stepped closer, but the boy shrank back, his eyes wary like those of a small animal abandoned. Too many times to trust anyone anymore. I'm trying, Leo, but you're not giving me a chance. The boy gripped the backpack straps tighter. I don't need anyone's pity. I just need someone who won't disappear. This time it was Jackson who fell silent. That statement simple, yet drawn from a deep, unhealed scar. He looked away from Leo, sitting down on the chair across from him, his hands resting loosely, weary. I'm not good at this. I've never been anyone's father before, but I'm here. Not to save you, but to be with you. That's all. A gentle breeze slipped through the crack in the glass door. The two of them sat there, one trying to learn how to lower himself, the other trying to learn how to trust. No one shed a tear, but that room, for the first time, was no longer completely silent. It was beginning to listen. The phone rang just as Jackson stood before a presentation board. in the middle of an important meeting with the board of directors. Every eye in the room turned to him, not because of the ringing, but because someone like Jackson Ellis never let his phone interrupt a meeting. He glanced at the screen, an unknown number. Then he froze when he saw the small text beneath it, Leo's school nurse. The blood in his veins seemed to drain away. "Excuse me, I have to take this." Without waiting for a response, he stepped outside, his hand trembling slightly as he pressed the phone to his ear. "Mr. Ellis? This is Leo's school nurse. He's having severe chest pain, shortness of breath, rapid heartbeat. We've called an ambulance." The next words didn't reach Jackson's ears. There was only a ringing sound, and a fear he'd never known suddenly gripped him tight. The hospital. Leo lay on the bed, his thin frame swallowed by the stark white sheets. His face was pale, his breathing faint, as if it might slip away from his chest at any moment. Jackson sat beside him, holding his son's hand, for the first time daring to call him that without any conditions clouding his mind. A doctor entered, speaking softly. "He doesn't have a heart condition. This was an acute anxiety attack, a disorder caused by prolonged stress." Jackson looked at him, incredulous. "Stress? He's only 10. A child doesn't need to be grown to bear things beyond their capacity." The words stabbed into Jackson's chest like a knife, not because they were wrong, but because they were cruelly right. He turned to look at Leo, now asleep from exhaustion, his hand still clutching Jackson's, faintly but clinging as if it were a survival instinct. That night, Jackson didn't return to the penthouse. He stayed by the hospital bed, his eyes never leaving his son's steadily breathing face. He thought back to all the times he'd told himself, "I'll take care of him. After I close this deal, I'll spend time with him when things settle down. I'll be there. Soon." But for a child who had lost his mother, who had been abandoned by the world, soon was a luxury, and settled was a stranger that never arrived. The next morning, Jackson walked into his office. Through the glass window, the city hummed along as usual, but he didn't. He called Angela. "Prepare my resignation letter, send it to the entire executive board." Angela was silent for 3 seconds. Then, longest pause she'd ever taken. "Are you sure?" "Yes," he said, his eyes fixed on the photo on his desk, a photo he'd placed there that morning, Leo, smiling faintly, from one of the rare times they'd eaten ice cream together by the river. "I built this empire to feel invincible," he whispered, "but my son is losing ground in his own life, and I can't accept that." For the first time, Jackson Ellis, the man who once didn't know what loss felt like, understood that the thing worth holding on to wasn't a title, but the small hand that had once trembled as it reached for him amidst the wreckage. The penthouse no longer echoed with the sound of late-night typing or the exhausting drone of international phone calls. Instead, Jackson woke up early each morning to prepare simple meals for two, learned how to fold clothes for a boy who didn't like wearing anything too new, and, for the first time, discovered what it felt like to wait for someone to finish school. Leo, once a silent shadow in the lavish home, had begun to leave traces of himself. A shoe tossed askew, an unfinished comic book on the sofa, a scribbled drawing taped to the fridge with the messy words, "Dad and me." And in those small details, Jackson realized he hadn't lost anything. He was just beginning to gain. One weekend afternoon, as they strolled through the park together, Leo suddenly said, "If Mom were still alive, she probably wouldn't believe Dad's walking around in sneakers." Jackson laughed, but after the laughter faded, he grew quiet for a moment. "Do you think she'd be proud?" Leo didn't answer right away. He tilted his head to look at the sunlit blue sky, then gave a slight nod. "If you keep going. For people like me and Mom used to be." That statement was a seed Jackson hadn't expected, but once planted, it grew within him quickly. A few weeks later, the Helena Foundation was officially born, a charity named after the woman both father and son owed so much to. A mother who never asked for anything but left behind the greatest legacy, love, and resilience. Jackson didn't establish it as a way to atone, but as a promise. They attended the inaugural ceremony together, Leo in a slightly oversized white shirt, Jackson for once ditching the suit jacket for a rolled-up sleeved shirt. On a small stage in front of rows of children from shelters across the city, Leo spoke briefly. "I used to think hope was a luxury, but today I know hope is something that can be rebuilt. Like a house, it just takes someone willing to start." From the audience, Jackson looked up at his son, no longer hiding behind him, but standing firm as part of the world. That evening, they sat on the balcony, the city's warm golden lights glowing in the distance. "I used to think standing high up was enough to feel safe," Jackson said softly. "But really, standing next to you, that's when I stopped being afraid of falling." Leo leaned his head against Jackson's shoulder, saying nothing, but his steady breathing, his warm heartbeat, it was an answer that didn't need words. In the gentle darkness, the father and son were no longer two fragmented pieces temporarily bound by duty. They were a thread woven together by the past, by loss, and now by a future. A future named Helena. The sky was clear, not a single cloud in sight. In front of the gates of the first center of the Helena Foundation, red ribbons stretched across, swaying gently in the breeze as if beckoning a new chapter for lives once broken. Jackson stood quietly in a corner, hands clasped in front of him. No expensive suit, no entourage, no close-up cameras. Today, he wasn't a CEO, nor a symbol of success. He was simply the father of the boy holding the red scissors, Leo. The child who once curled up in a hospital bed corner now stood amidst the crowd, his face lit by the sun and by something else. Belief. "We're not building a building," Leo's voice rang out, clear and steady. "We're building a place where no one has to sleep on the streets anymore. A place where, if a child says, 'I don't have anyone,' the answer will be, 'You do now.'" In the audience, Jackson held his breath, his chest tightened. Not from ordinary emotion, but from something long lost, the feeling of living for someone other than himself. Leo bowed his head and cut the red ribbon amid resounding applause. A second later, Jackson saw his son's eyes sweep through the crowd and land on him. Leo didn't say anything. He simply raised his hand, palm facing Jackson, a silent signal only the two of them understood. Jackson stepped forward, and amid the cheers of the crowd, he took that hand. That afternoon, they walked together through the center's halls, where orphaned children sat drawing pictures, where a little girl had just asked Leo, "Are you the one who built this?" And he'd only smiled, shaking his head. "I just added one brick." Jackson watched his son quietly, then blurted out, "Are you mad at me? For coming too late?" Leo turned, tilting his head slightly. "Yes." The answer was blunt like a small knife. But then, he took Jackson's hand, continuing to walk, and said slowly, "But if you hadn't come, none of this would exist today." Jackson gave a faint smile, his eyes suddenly welling up. In a strange moment, all surrounding noise faded. All that remained was the soft sound of their footsteps on the floor and a gentle warmth spreading through Jackson's body, a feeling he'd never touched in all his years of busyness, success, and power. Being a father. Not because DNA confirmed it, not because someone called him by that title, but because he was walking beside his son, and both of them were moving forward, not running away.